Just to introduce myself, for those who don't know me, I'm Frieder Hofheim. I'm the founder of Kino Flo. I'm Canadian, living in Los Angeles. I moved here in '83. At the time, the industry had come to a brief stop because the government, in its wisdom, had stopped all the tax credits. And I had an opportunity to come down here, and I did that, and it sort of all took off from there. So anyway, I'm here, and it's come quite a long way from being a gaffer down here and starting Kino Flo. But in the process, you know, we've made our name in the fluorescent world for understanding film, motion picture film, understanding the colorimetry of the film. And now we've gone into the LED world, and with the LED world, we're faced with a whole new host of issues. And this presentation is sort of an attempt to try to explain some of the challenges we have. I don't have answers for everything. I can define the problem, explain it, and there are ways of dealing with this stuff. And I'll have some suggestions that hopefully will help everyone doing this, you know, being in our, trying to resolve some of these color issues. So let me just move straight on then, and what I'll be, I need to. So this is a presentation that I've been doing internationally, primarily to cinematography groups and to lighting groups. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about understanding what is the spectral response of a camera. When we say spectral response of a camera, what does it actually mean? We're going to talk about color gamut. We use this term a lot for, you know, Rec 709, P3, 2020. What does it actually mean in terms of lighting, and how is that significant? I'm going to talk about white light spectrum. What is it? We talk about it. How is it different? I'll talk about these the challenges that we all have as manufacturers of color matching between different manufacturers, and how do you, as the end user, how do you process that those challenges? I'll talk about how to use Gamut and XY in matching gel colors, and I'll talk about camera profiles to account for these, you know, the use of camera profiles to try to account for these differences in camera response. So what I'm going to show you now is this is a test that Jeff Boyle from the CML website put together. And it was very simple. He thought, you know, the one constant that we have in the world, pretty much for all of us, is tungsten light. You put a quartz bubble in a head, turn it on, and whether you're in New York, Toronto, Moscow, or any other part of the world, that tungsten light, short of a few voltage differences, is going to be pretty consistent. So you'd think that manufacturers of cameras would use tungsten as a standard. And so if you were to look at tungsten between all these different cameras, you should see a pretty straight linear comparison. And so in this test, we use, the first shot is going to be tungsten. Camera is balanced to tungsten. The second shot is an LED light source balanced to tungsten in the same tungsten setting as the quartz light was. Jeff did not tell me what light it was, which LED it was, and it shouldn't really matter. It just shows you how an LED is going to be a little different between the tungsten and the LED. And what's also interesting to note is when you see all these different cameras, how they actually treat tungsten a little differently, where you would expect consistency. And again, I'm preaching to the choir here. You sort of know this intuitively from all the work you've done, but here's sort of a nice illustration of it. So here it goes. So this right now is tungsten, and there's an LED tungsten. C200, LED. And I don't know how some of this is going to carry over on other monitors, but you should be able to see some of these differences. LED. So it's tungsten on a Fuji, and that's an LED. Again, nothing's changed in terms of the light sources. The only thing that's changing here is the camera. There's a Venice in tungsten. So from that, you can really see how cameras, all looking at the same source in tungsten, have variation. And then once you go into the LED aspect of it, you can really see some dramatic differences between these cameras. And so the idea is now, okay, so why is this happening? What's going on? So what we need to do is we really need to understand when we talk about white light spectrum, what exactly is it? And so we need to dig into the fundamentals. And there's fundamentally two ways of trying to visualize white light. And so on the right here, we have the CIE color space chart or chromosticity diagram. And on the outside perimeter of this horseshoe are all your saturated visible light colors. Through the center of this is this arc, and white light, quote unquote, white light tracks along that curve. It's also known as the black body curve or the Planckian curve. Another way of looking at white light is to consider the spectral scale, the Kelvin scale. Now our eyes see from 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. You know, if you go anywhere to the right of 700, it becomes into IR. Anywhere to the left of 400, you get into the UV. And again, our eyes are not sensitive to that. So when we think of this Planckian curve, or black body curve, this light is going to track all along. You can see various color points that are illustrated on here pertaining to daylight. So when we say, well, what exactly is Planckian locus? We talk about Kelvin temperature, and we have to think of it, well, it's kind of, if you consider a black body being something like a filament, and as that filament warms up and changes color, you track along that curve, and you go into, basically, into the white light, into the higher Kelvins. So that is a sort of an easy illustration of what Kelvin tracking on the Planckian curve represents. It's warming up a black body to the point that it goes from a orange tone into a daylight tone. So now, depending on where any of these colors track, so if every one of these horizontal lines here, or these intersecting lines, they refer to CCT, or correlated color temperature. And you can be anywhere on that line and say, I'm 3000 Kelvin. You can be above the Planckian, below the Planckian, and you'd be accurate in saying that's my Kelvin. The feature that's interesting to note is that if you're on the Planckian, you're most probably going to have a neutral white tone. If you're below the Planckian, it's going to look somewhat magenta. If you're above the Planckian, it's going to be, it's going to have a green cast to it. So since we're a company that was always working in developing lamps and understanding Kelvin, we thought, well, moving into the LED world, what could be simpler? We know how to blend phosphors. We can translate this into LEDs. And so we started off with a 2700 Kelvin source and a 6500 Kelvin source. And you said, what could be finer than to just blend those two together? And we should be able to cover the entire range. And so that's basically what we did. The thing we discovered is that, and this is what bicolors are, by the way. You start off with a warm tone, you have a daylight tone, put the two together. The thing you notice is that it tracks as a linear, on a linear principle. So it doesn't follow the Planckian. And so the minute you start blending them, you're starting to fall off the Planckian and you're going magenta. And when you're in the middle, you're out of sort of your worst case situation for magenta. Now this applies to all bicolor that are on the market. The fact that most shooting, you decide to shoot in a warm tone or you decide to shoot in daylight, it's hardly noticeable. So bicolors initially, the first models we introduced were bicolor. And the fact that they were so close to what the camera response was, and the color looked great, everybody was thrilled, but there was a noticeable shift into the magenta as you started blending those colors, those Kelvins. And so the solution obviously was to add some plus green. So I think at most a quarter plus green was enough to correct it if you're in the midpoint. But we said, well, we can't stick with this method because the whole idea is that we should be able to track our Kelvin through the entire range. So the best way of doing that is, well, by adding some RGB LEDs, we could now bring in that certain amount of green or magenta to actually calibrate our light source. So as you're blending these two, you're now tracking the Planckian. And so it's, well, that's cool. We could do that. And we thought this would be a very straightforward deal. But then we noticed that some cameras, as we showed you earlier, cameras see, especially LED, Kelvin white point, a little different. So depending on the camera, you could actually be right on the mark if you're on the Planckian curve. Some cameras we noted track slightly above and some track slightly below. So this created a bit of a conundrum. You say, okay, well, great. Now what are we going to, we have to decide on something. We can't just post every different camera. It's a huge amount of testing to come up with all this data. So we said, well, the most common camera is the Alexa. So let's just track the Alexa and as close as possible encapsulate the, bring in the red and the Sony. And so we fudged the numbers a bit on the Alexa, opened up the tolerance a little bit so that we could not be too far off on the other cameras. And then still adding the ability to add some green, add some magenta on the day that you're shooting. You say, well, it still needs a little touch of correction. So what we really are talking about here is we're considering the electronic cinema camera is very much like film. So just like film stocks had a particular characteristic and color response. I mean, cinematographers would choose Kodak over Fuji or AGFA because there were certain spectral qualities of this film that were unique to it. And as a cinematographer, that was your task to choose which one to work with. And never did you try to avoid mixing different manufacturers of film stocks because it would create a huge color timing issue. And the electronic cinema cameras are actually no different. At the same time, we're saying, we've always had full spectrum lights. If you look at it historically, carbon arc, tungsten quartz, xenon arc, HM line fluorescent. When you really look at these sources, they were all full spectrum light. Even the fluorescent, where we said, well, yes, but it has a green spike. It did, but we were able to correct that green by putting the color point on the Planckian. So we were the neutral white. And when you look at that spectrum compared to an LED, the fluorescent spectrum actually has more spectral data in it than an LED spectrum of today. So I thought, a little bit of a history lesson is kind of interesting at this stage. And when we go back to 1901, I mean, we're talking about film stocks that were 5 ASA, yet they were shooting in studio. They were creating a soft light. And how the hell did they do it? I mean, originally I thought, well, this is just, Edison's, rotating soundstage, which was open to the sky. You put a diffuser on top of it and you tracked with the sky and everything was soft, but there was directional soft light. And I came across these images from 1901, and these were Cooper Hewitt mercury discharge lamps. You have to think of the film stock at the time. Orthochromatic film was only sensitive to blue and green. Panchromatic had sensitivities to red and the broader spectrum. But since the camera was only sensitive to blue and green, a mercury discharge lamp is only a blue-green spectrum. So it was actually perfectly harmonized to the film stock. And now that we're in this COVID world, when I think of these lights, it's like, actually, this was a UVC lamp. This was high in ultraviolet emission. So whether they were shooting in the pandemic of 1918, if they were shooting with these Cooper Hewitts, they were most probably decontaminating the set. So I have no idea how that played out back in 1918, but I did find another image, which is around 1915, and this was the Cooper Hewitt lights in Metro Studios. This is before they became Metro Goldwyn Mayer. They look like a bunch of Image 80s. They look like a bunch of Kinos. And what's really unique is when you look at the upper portion here, they're all on tracks and they have a pulley system. Part of the unique thing of this lamp was that in order to ignite it, you had to tilt the lamp. This lamp construction consisted of a tube that looked very much like a fluorescent, but at the end it had a giant ball of mercury. And by tilting the lamp, the mercury would flow to the opposite end. It would strike a cathode. And as you righted the fixture, it will pull this plasma arc stream down with it. And now you had this very bright plasma arc that was blue-green light, perfectly harmonized to the film stock, and you were able to shoot. And this was very typical of a stage where they're obviously sort of mimicking sky, and you can actually see above it still the glass ceiling that they had prior to installing these Cooper Hewitts. So historically, we've always been able to harmonize the light source with the camera technology. And now for the first time, we're actually using a light source that doesn't necessarily harmonize perfectly with the recording technology. So the LED is a discontinuous spectrum. And since these cameras all have unique spectral response curves, this is where we start to get some of these challenges, and we start to see how cameras see the same LEDs differently. So how do we measure this stuff? Well, here's sort of I think many of us have seen these instruments. The old Minoltas over here, and some of the newer Sekonics, and even these Minoltas here. All of these older models in today's world really have no more relevance. I always advise people who have them, either you keep them as a museum piece, or may not be able to do it now in the COVID period, but at other times I would say throw a garden party, crack a few bottles of champagne, dig a hole, bury these things, and move on into the 21st century. The Sekonic C700 is about the closest thing that I can point to nowadays that actually is relevant to our industry. It's designed for our industry. But take note that the corrective data on those meters is predicated on the average response curve of an HDSLR, not that of a cinema camera. So using it as a comparative meter, looking at different light sources, it gives you at least a measurement perspective that you can say there's a difference of X between these, and it then gives you something to at least you can move forward and test on. It also gives you now indexes such as CRI, TLCI, SSI, RF, and I'll explain that. So the tools to measure this light quality of cinema production, none of them actually give us corrective data. So this is where the real challenge lies in, how do we actually deal with all these different light sources? To understand what these meters are, the information they're providing us, CRI is the one that gets bantered about the most, color rendering index, and it's really said about it. I think it started off in the late 30s, this measurement index, and it was related to the way the eye perceived the light. And so you either have CRI as an 8-chip or a 15-chip evaluation. Now, when it comes to the LED world, and especially to cameras, simply comparing 5 or 8 color chips is woefully insufficient. And the International Commission on Illumination, the CIE, or the IATSE, which is the Illumination Engineering Society, they have summarily rejected CRI as an index for evaluating LEDs. And I think as an industry, as a motion picture industry, we should summarily reject it as well. Yet there's still a lot of manufacturers that are stuck in this, and a lot of it has to do with the reporting that happens when you send these out for profiling from light metric companies that measure lights. You really need to ask them to not provide CRI data, and I think people will start to get used to what the next index is. And the next index that is being recommended by the CIE is called the IES TM30-18. 18 refers to the year in which the standard was adopted. I think there's also a TM30-15. And we'll most probably have other digits following the 18 as new things come along. So the big difference here is that instead of using 8 and 15 colors, we're using 99 colors. And it's sort of rendered as on this Sekonic meter as a color wheel. And you start to see where all these 99 color points, how they fall within that defined area. So there are quite a few indexes that you can reference within TM30. The one that is most relevant to us, or there are two actually, one is the fidelity index, and it's referred to as RF. Now that characterizes the average difference in color for those 99 chips, and a given Kelvin or a reference source. That means, so whatever your reference source is, and in this case, I think you can select it as either being tungsten or daylight. I believe it's predicated on daylight. You can see if it's, how close it is. And in this case, this is one of our readings from one of our labs, and you can see that the numbers are all very high. And in fact, in one regard, it actually exceeds, and that is in the Gamut index. Now, Gamut index refers to the average saturation level of that test source to the reference source that we're comparing. That means that if I have an LED, it may actually exceed, or it may have more energy in that source and maybe oversaturate the sample from what the daylight or the reference source would do. So it's possible to get values that are over 100, and in this case, it's very negligible. So, perfect score is 100. So I think that's, for an LED, those are very high numbers. But again, what do I do with that data as a cinematographer? You're standing there looking at it, goes, looks pretty good, but it still doesn't give me information on exactly where does that leave me on does it give me a slight green hue, a slight magenta hue, depending on the camera I'm working with, depending on the settings. It doesn't really give me any kind of actionable data. TLCI, Television Lighting Consistency Index. And again, this is an index that grew out of this frustration of how do we measure these freaking lights. And so the thought was, okay, TLCI, we're gonna predicate it on, again, since this came from, this was developed by a BBC engineer, Alan Roberts, and his background was in camera. And so he said, okay, the first iteration of this was based on Plemicon cameras. And he felt there was very little difference between camera response on Plemicon cameras and today's cinema cameras. Well, I think that position shifted quickly upon further analysis. And so now he's using an average response curve of the modern HD TV studio cameras that use CCDs or CMOS sensors. But again, this is an averaged curve. Now it does give us some information, and it's laid out in an interesting way so that subjectively you can see on sort of a Macbeth color scale differences between your test source and your control source, and you can see slight hue differences. And then from that, you can go, okay, it's not 100% match, and I may have some issues in certain areas, but does it give me that corrective data that I need to be able to tune in a little extra green or a little extra magenta? Well, it doesn't really give me that. So I think it has its limitations. The Academy, they've come up with SSI, and again, you'll find that also on the Sekonic meter. And here the question is, again, it's grown out of this frustration. We have no way of evaluating these light sources. And so here the approach was, okay, let's just forget about the eye perception. Let's just compare it. Initially it was, let's just compare it to a natural full spectrum light. So natural full spectrum light is, well, the one constant is tungsten, and the other one is daylight. So let's forget about human vision. Let's just predicate it on what we know. So we know tungsten. So here's a tungsten curve. And then we measure an LED, and we overlay that. And now you can see how these are one is an LED curve for tungsten, one is the actual tungsten. You say, no, but there are these intersecting areas where it's not matching up. So let's apply a value to those areas and come up with an index that will give us this offset, and it'll put a value to this offset. And so now these are their words, not mine. This is how it's described. So high values indicate a predictable rendering by most cameras, as well as quality of visual appearance. Okay, it doesn't say what a high value is. That's left up to us to determine. Now, a score of 100 indicates a perfect match. Low values may produce good colors with a particular camera, but not with others. So it's vague at best. So what do I do with that information? I can't act upon that information. So at best, this information is of academic interest, I guess. Now, lately it's been used more to try to compare other LEDs. Just say compare one set of LEDs to another set of LEDs, and you go, okay, well, how close are they matched? They can be matched maybe a little better. But still, there's nothing there that gives me corrective data. And the fear that I have, if someone without doing a lot of testing, just simply measures a bunch of lights and compares it to daylight or tungsten and says, oh my, we've got a low value. I'm just not going to use this light. So we went ahead and using our spectrum, which we know is going to be good on the camera, we set up all these 4 different indexes and said, well, what do we get? So with CRI, which we're not recommending, but on CRI, we got a high value. So again, I think anything over 90 would be considered a high value. I mean, historically, it's been that. TLCI, 97, and SSI, 71. So the one outlier is that 71. So 71, if I were to not have done any testing and I'm just sort of sorting through options, I'm going to reject that one. Mind you, by the time you've tested a whole bunch of LEDs, you're going to find out that 71 is actually not a bad number. But that's where this vagueness, I think, does set up a challenge on how do you use this index and when you're on a set and the director of photography is looking at you going, so what's wrong with this light? Well, it's showing me a 71, we'll get rid of it. Well, it could be something else in the set that's wrong. So I'm saying this is just not answering the questions that I think we need to have answered. So finding all these measurement devices inadequate, we said the only way to do this correctly is we need to develop our own spectrometer. And what we need to do is we need to understand the response curve of the cinema camera. So we set about doing that. And I was very fortunate to have the same engineer from Kodak, who is now retired, lend his expertise to developing this. Now, Kodak at the time when I started Kino Flo had this brilliant spectrometer where they actually had the response curves of film stock. And so you could, and he had a catalog of lenses and coatings. And so when I went to him with our first challenge, how do I take this fluorescent light source and balance it for film stock, we could very precisely hone it in. And this is sort of an extension of the work that we did in those early days, like 34 odd years ago. So what we're looking at here is sort of my field of data that I work with. Here on the lower left is the raw scope spectrum. So we see 400 nanometers along here, and we see 700, which is where our eyes cut off, and most of the cameras you'll find out will cut off there as well. And then we calibrate it, and this is now the raw spectrum properly calibrated. And so this is our 2700 Kelvin starting point. Then there's a rendering here of the CIE color space chart, and there's our black body curve, and that color point designates where it is relative to the curve. And in this case, it's right on the curve.
Hey, Peter.
Yeah.
There's a question by Dan Fletcher. He asked, do manufacturers consistently shift their sensors green or magenta? I.e., does Sony always shift green?
It's different, and this is the part that we found. And the deeper I dig into it, you'll start to see some of the things that come into play. We found some cameras in a warm tone, and again, depending on the spectrum of the LED that you're working with, we saw that on some manufacturers, the camera will see it slightly above the Planckian, and as it moves into daylight, it'll actually track below. So you go, oh, whoa, what's going on? So there are inconsistencies, and this is what makes this even more challenging. But a lot of it has to come down to how this white is constructed, and this is part of what I'm going to be explaining here is how important the white spectrum is and how manufacturers arrive at their white spectrum.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So what we set up this field as, we have 3 rows of data, and the rows down here refer to it's basically the CI. I used very much the same methodology as CRI. We used the Macbeth chart. We said, let's just give those values. We'll use the same methodology, the same mathematics, and let's come up with what we call it. Maybe I'm jumping ahead of myself. Just let me go back to this. We came up with a rendering index just as a reference point. It's nothing that I can do any corrective action on, but anyway, it gives me an idea, a very quick overview that this has more rendering than the next camera. We have a camera field where, in this case, I'm comparing a area mirror. Again, we read these cameras, we profiled them, we have their spectral response. we have in this case, a red Mysterium and a Panavision 8K red. Now, I would expect these two to be very close because they use a similar sensor or the same sensor. CCT, this is the actual CCT, this line is the actual CCT that the spectrometer, not just a handheld device, but a scientific instrument, reads it. So we're saying it's 2700. To be very precise, it's 2659. Again, there's tolerances in all of these things. So the tolerance of a handheld meter, when you read this with a handheld meter, it come awfully close. The camera CCT is really interesting. And this kind of data is what really got us going, because we're saying the way the camera would see that light source. So the Amira was actually seeing it at 2700. The Mysterium was actually seeing that same light source at 2500 Kelvin. So it was actually rendering it warmer. And the Panavision was rendering it yet warmer than the other two cameras. Below that, just for a point of reference, I wanted to know, what is the old meter saying, like the old Minoltas? And we saw that they always read warmer, which was a problem when we first started Kino Flo and we had a KF55. I knew it was actually 6500 Kelvin. But since all the meters that all the cinematographers had showed it as 55, we said, okay, I'm not going to argue with you guys. You have your handheld meters, it's going to be 55. But we know scientifically it was 6500. And so this is just a reference for myself to understand what the previous generation of handheld instruments would show. Then we have other data here, XY, which I'm going to get into later and help explain. What was photographic rendering index is what I talked about a little earlier. So it's just a way of understanding a difference in the way these spectrums see the light. And the most important was up here, this little gel designation. And if anybody has any windows that are open in this corner over here, you might try to minimize them. It's a gel reference. And so this is where it really plays out on the camera to see if a camera sees it slightly above, on, or below the Planckian. And so a value of 0.12 equals to about 1/8 of a correction, of a gel correction. So in this case, they're all below 0.12. And so there's absolutely, it's essentially with intolerance, it's on the Planckian. You're not going to do any better than that. So that is sort of an illustration of how we go about determining, reading, and understanding what's going on. And this is also where I come up with the data, and you'll see some of these charts. And it's going to dig a little deep into the weeds, but this is where it gets rather fascinating, and you start to understand the issue. I think, were there any questions in the meantime? I could pause for a moment.
No, there isn't any.
Okay, cool.
Right.
So what is eye response? I mean, here's sort of a spectral chart of what the eye sees. This is, here's our 400 nanometer down here in the lower left, 700 and on over where IR. And let's overlay that with this is a film stock. So this was daylight film stock. And you start to see how it's different from the eye's response. First and foremost, it's interesting to note is that it was sensitive into the UV. Now, anyone who shot film was aware of this. For that reason, we had sky filters or UV filters, because there was sensitivity there in the UV spectrum. And if you wanted to control your sky density, you'd want to make sure that you didn't overexpose your sky, and having a sky filter helped you do that. You also see that the red response is shifted over from the eye's response. And in film days, it was always important to shoot camera tests before principal photography. And you did this in conjunction with the art department, with the makeup department, with the wardrobe department, because there were certain colors that were not going to render out correctly. And those colors usually fell into resolving cyan or teal colors down around the 500 mark. And you can see where these, the green and blue line intersects. There's just not a lot going on in that wavelength. So if the light isn't there, it can't reflect back from a real world colored object. And so if the choice of color happened to be right in that range, you're going to have some challenges reproducing that. The same goes on the yellow-orange, where it was maybe not quite as noticeable, but there were certain elements there that were not easily reproduced. So for that reason, we always shot color tests. We always did makeup tests and wardrobe tests just so that we weren't surprised on the day of shooting. Now here is a very good camera that we're all familiar with. It's irrelevant to talk about which one it is. What's more important is to understand how these curves relate to the way our eyes see, and how these curves now from this camera relate to another camera, which is this camera. And here we see an immediate difference where there is some UV response, and we see that there's a broader red response curve. This doesn't make it any better or worse than the other cameras. It just shows a difference. And when you're working with a discontinuous light source, this is where you start to see some of these differentiations between cameras. This starts to account for some of those differences that you're seeing. You're going, well, this camera's fine on this. Why is the other one seeing it a little differently? This goes a long way in explaining it. Another camera, very highly regarded, fabulous camera, great color, very different response curve. Gamut. We talk about gamut. There's another way of looking at light. So gamut refers to the entire range of colors available on a particular device, such as a cinema camera, a lighting fixture, a projector, or a monitor. Now, all of these have a gamut, and so it's very often defined as a triangle within the CIE color space. And the one thing that's definite is that all of these devices don't necessarily all share the same gamut. They don't all necessarily align. And what we see over here is actually what we refer to as Rec 709. Other common gamuts, that you would have heard about are P3, and this is a gamut that comes out of the digital projection arena. It's a little bigger than 709. 2020, a lot of the monitors are now going to 2020. A lot of the LED display walls are also trying to get up into 2020. And you can see what happens is their ability to capture color is much broader. So the bigger your gamut gets, the more colors you can encompass. The one thing to keep in mind is in the middle, you have your white, and that's common to all of them. So this is where white spectrum becomes really critical. If you've got a good white spectrum, that's common to everything. No matter if you're in P3, 709, 2020, it doesn't matter. The other gamut that you're going to hear a lot about that's ACEs. And so ACEs is this all-encompassing gamut that I'm going to go on and explain. Oh, my phones are ringing. Now, a camera may actually have a wider color gamut than can be displayed or projected, and I'm going to show you some of those differences. So, a cinema camera can capture a very wide color space, and now we have these 4 cameras. And since we modeled them, I thought, what would be more interesting than to actually play this out? Let's plot these response curves. Let's plot them as a gamut and see how these gamuts are, how they align. Are they the same? So in no particular order. So again, I'm not trying to show that one camera is above or below or better or worse. These are differences that account for some of the challenges that we have. And again, got to remember, everyone is sensitive to the white. There's equal amount of sensitivity in the white zone. So here goes. So that's your 709, and off we go. And these are all different gamuts. So we can just point out some things. So some cameras are maybe a little more sensitive into the very deep reds. One camera has a lot of capture outside of the other ones into green zones up there. So these cameras can actually capture information that's really amazing. Yet in the end, you still have to think about how's this going to look when it gets puts out in its final display format in 709, 2020, P3. And if the information is there, it'll all have to be remapped into this output gamut. So this is where understanding gamut really becomes important in understanding how we try to color balance these things. We talked about film. Now, in the film days, it was all analog. We never talked of gamut in the film days. But since we have the data, and we are now in the 21st century, we are talking about gamut, I thought, okay, well, what if we were to plot film stocks, daylight and tungsten? How do they compare to what these cameras were seeing? And so there's Rec 2020, which is where a lot of the display devices are going towards. And so let's see how this works out. So here's tungsten. And you can see it falls just out of 709, but within 2020. And there's daylight. So what it tells us is that if you're going to remaster a film negative into 2020, your general white reproduction is going to be pretty much the same. What you're going to see is an enhancement in the saturated colors. And so that means wherever you had colors in the set that were maybe saturated, those are going to appear more vibrant as you go into 2020. So there is a good reason to say, from a previously mastered 709, remaster in 2020, and you're going to realize it much more the way it would have been projected. Because you have to remember, this is now on the film, and the film was projecting it straight out onto the cinema screen. So you're much closer now to being able to reproduce that experience of what that film looked like when you're sitting in a cinema in the days in which it was first shot. IATSE Gamut. What the hell is it? There's a lot of talk about IATSEs, and it can be very easily explained. And this is an ongoing gamut that is evolving. It's not set in stone, and a lot of new data is being sort of defined in this gamut. It was created by the Academy of Motion Picture Sciences and Arts and Sciences, and it's called the Academy Color Encoding System. And it's a way of holding spectral data now in a digital format, as we used to have film negative. So where film negative was your physical embodiment of all the data, now this is a way of holding spectral data. And by encompassing the entire visual field, the idea is this should be able to take into account anything that comes as we move into the future. So as we move into the future, we're using this digital source master. That means that all the things that you've done color timing wise, if it is done through ACEs, all that data, all that digital data that defines how the film has been timed and mastered, the intent of the cinematographer is now basically locked into this data file. And as new formats come up, and you say, okay, well, for instance, going from 709 to 2020, and you have your digital source master in 709, through the simple use of CTL or color transform language, you can now take that original source master and retranslate it into new color points that will now allow it to format itself in the 2020 space. And so the hope is that you do not lose the intent of the cinematographer, which is an important element, because as we saw with colorization of black and white, who's going to make that call as to how those images get treated? And so it really, I think this is some level of assurance for cinematographers that there will be the ability to maintain that look. At the same time, the danger is, from a moral perspective, anybody can go in there and basically, once you have the raw source data, you can go there and mess with it and do whatever you want. So that's the one, again, we're in the digital world. The shit can happen. Our gamut, the Kino Flows have a gamut, and that's defined by the colors that we choose to work with. So we're dealing with red, green, blue. Those are defined by those color points, and by two white spectrums, 2700 and 6500. And any colors that we can reproduce are going to be reproduced within that space. So there's 709. So we're actually reproducing colors that will not be reproduced in 709. So you can actually see these colors on the set. The camera may be able to record, because you saw how wide some of those gamuts were for the camera. But when it comes to reproducing it later on in 709, some of those saturation levels may not be there. So there's the concept of unexpected or unattainable expectations. Is if a director falls in love with a certain green that's out there, and 709 won't reproduce it, well, this is why. This is why. P3, very close to P3, there's going to be a little green offset there, and 2020. So there are going to be some things that we cannot fully reproduce in P3 and 2020. Those color points are going to be modified on our next color release, which is coming up next year. Our whites are all going to be maintained. We're going to see some more saturated abilities in the colors. So bottom line is those RGB color points define the range of the gamut. Now, this doesn't just apply to the Kino Flos. This applies to every manufacturer. And as manufacturers, we all have our reasons for choosing our green point, the red point, and the blue point. And there is no standard for this. And this accounts for more of the challenges that we have as we try to combine these light sources. So, as I said, the color gamut of fixtures is determined by the choice of primary colors. And by blending these colors, we call this additive color mixing. So if I blend the green and the red together to get to a yellow, that's an additive color mix. Now, if I need to reproduce colors that are out here, and I'm a manufacturer that says I need to expand my saturated colors, I may want to add some more color points. So amber, cyan, lime green, rose red, these are all colors that can be added so that when you now expand the gamut, you can now reach some of those colors that can't be obtained through a simple RGB process. So if the objective is to hit certain saturated colors, you need an expanded gamut. If it's all about the white, that's the one thing these all have in common. And so this is where the balance starts to come into play is, you know, it may be one thing to hit the saturated colors, but, you know, 80%, 90% of what we do is all about reproducing skin tone. And you somehow need to balance out all these different demands and try to do justice to all of them. And that's where it gets to be very challenging. So that full spectrum is what assures the best skin tone. It also assures what is illuminated in terms of the set. All those colors and saturated colors and pastel colors, if the spectrum is there in the white, that will always reflect back on the camera. And so if the display gamut handles it, it'll be in the display gamut. So color points that fall outside can still be, go back to, if there's a color point that you can't get to with your RGB mix, there's another way of doing it, and that's by adding a color gel. So in this case, I'm citing an example of where a color point falls out here. How do we get there? So simply by adding a gel to this white spectrum, we can then reach that by getting outside of the gamut. And we call that kind of color generation as subtractive. So the bottom line is, we've got all these capabilities and all these LEDs. We can hit a lot of different colors. There's some colors we won't hit. But in the end, if there's a specific color that you need to reproduce and you have the gel to do it, your best bet is to put it on either the daylight or the tungsten source, and it should come up pretty close. As long as your white is a full spectrum white. If you have a diminished white, there may still be some challenge.
Hey, Frieder?
Don't throw away your gels. Yeah.
Quick question from Adam Rinkema. He said, what is the effect on screen visually of capturing a color in the camera that the final render is 709? Can't render?
Yeah, well, I'll show you. As we go through this, I'm going to actually show you examples of this. And it's quite stunning, actually. I'm going to get to that. Good question. So talking about this whole use of gel on an instrument. So AFI, the cinematographer fellows at AFI, they're required to come up with a lookbook, meaning, is there a color theme in this film? What is it? Let's define it. Let's put it into a book format. Let's show pictures, show the colors, and then in pre-production, test for it. Can that actually be reproduced in the camera that we're working with? So the test was set up like this. They used a tungsten light source, and In this case, it was working with Storaro yellow, which is very close to a Lee 101. So I went ahead and I reproduced this. And that's what it looks like. And so basically we read the tungsten light, we set the camera sensitivity to 2900. So in that mode, it should come out as a neutral gray or white, which it sort of does. And the Lee 101 on it, that's what it's going to look like on the camera. Okay. So then we say, okay, that's tungsten. Let's use an LED dialed to 2900 on the LED fixture. Let's add a gel to that fixture. It's a pretty good match. And then we said, okay, now we're just going to use the LED fixture. We are going to dial in Lee 101. It's still set at, the white zone is still set at 2900 Kelvin. The camera is still set to 2900 Kelvin. Let's see what that looks like. And that's what it looked like. And it was like, holy shit, what went wrong here? Okay, well, see if we can dial out the green. So went into the magenta and tried to mess with that. Nothing could get it out of that green. What was it? And so they came to the ASC Technology Committee and said, Joe, so what is it? I said, well, so first, everyone thought, well, maybe it was data translation to the desk. Maybe there's, some other coding issue and whatnot. And I felt, you know what, this is most probably an issue of camera response. Once we see how the camera is set up, we have to remember that cameras are all set up as the white being D65, daylight 6500. When we think of all the gamuts are defined by their white source as being daylight 6500. So I reproduced this test and I said, okay, so if this is what that gel looks like at 2900, what does it look like at 6500? I'm now going to change that camera to a sensitivity of 6500. And that's what happened. So what it tells me is that the camera's ability, since it's got a D65 chip in it, its ability to reproduce narrowband colors that are additive, in this case, this was subtractive, it could not resolve, it was not within the ability of that sensor and that software to resolve that, that setting. Yet, once it was pulled back to 6500, it was close to working. So here we have a limitation of camera response. And I said, okay, so now I want to picture this. How does this actually look? And if you look at it on a spectral chart, so the 2900 tungsten, you can see this is very typical. It's a very clean line. And then the gel on that, it just still shows a tremendous amount of spectral data through the entire range. But that's how this comes out on a spectrometer. So I said, okay, so that's tungsten with a gel. So what about LED with a gel? Okay, so now we see how this blue line here is different. The gel on an LED, but it's still giving us a good reproduction because this volume of yellow compared to this volume of yellow, the camera sees it pretty close to the same. Okay, so what's happening when we go to the next level? Now we start to see a huge difference. So this green is now reproduced in an additive, very narrow band. So, you've got your red, you got your green. Those are the 2 points. And when you blend them together, that's what the spectrum looks like. And the camera, which doesn't have a tremendous amount of sensitivity here, has trouble resolving that. So I think this to me was pretty amazing. How a gel actually, on a subtractive level, gives us a lot more spectral data to work with on the light source. And again, if that means that white Kelvin source has so much spectral detail and density, it can actually reproduce what the tungsten is reproducing. There's one last gamut. And again, this is digging deep into the weeds, but I think it's interesting to note. There's a guy named Michael Pointer, he was a Kodak scientist, and he wanted to plot out on, on today's technology, what are these cameras actually capable of reproducing? And so that is a gamut that he came up where you had a daylight illuminant. This would be, true daylight, and what it was actually capable of reflecting. And so you see the various gamuts laid out, and you see that it'll capture colors that are outside 709 and pretty much everything that's within 2020. So as camera technology moves more and more to being able to work in 2020, you're going to be able to reproduce anything that a daylight source falls on and reflects, which is good news, I guess. How do we create white light in LED systems? Well, here's sort of a rendering of different elements, and each one of these represents different colors. So we know that 2 full spectrum whites, that works. It also has certain challenges because unless you're tracking with RGBs, you're going to fall off the Planckian curve, and you're going to have some, in the mid-range, you're going to have some green magenta issues. We also know that if you do, actually going here, just RGBs give you white. Diminished white, because there's a lot of gaps in between them. A single white RGB, that works. There are a number of manufacturers that are doing that, and we're all used to working with those. The challenge there is that if you, let's say, have a white that is in the warm tone, and you now want to take it into the daylight, where you have all this full spectral data in the warm tone, as you move into daylight, well, the only thing you can really do to move the numbers mathematically is you're going to be adding basically some more blue and a little bit of green and red to keep it on the Planckian, but you're going to have a diminished range of white. And this is where some of these, on skin tones, you start to see some of these differences. Theatrical lighting companies that are more interested in reproducing all the different colors of their gel from the gel book, they may want to just stay out of white altogether, add some amber. Another one is, this is what Kino Flo is doing. We thought it was important to have 2 full spectrum whites so that if we're in a daylight mode, we've got a nice broad spectrum white in daylight and a full broad spectrum daylight, warm spectrum in the white tones and the warm tones. So this is what we're doing. Now, there are other manufacturers that are saying, let's expand upon it because we want to do both double duty. We want to be good in the whites and we want to be able to reproduce a lot of the other colors. So they're going to start adding amber. Some are going to go full tilt and throw a whole bunch of wavelengths in it. And some of that actually works very well, especially when it comes to gel reproduction. It gets a little squirrelier on the reproduction of whites because, again, once we see how all these different cameras respond to the white, it really comes down to how well a manufacturer has blended this color. And since we, depending on the camera you're using, so you may be great on one camera and may have certain challenges in another camera. But sort of in a very simplified chart, it sort of gives you, this is when you walk on a set and you say, this is a white light. Those are a lot of the options that you're working with. So it's not all the same. Where does that leave you? So just as an illustration of what goes on, here's the 2 whites represented in green, and here's a single white. This is a 3200. And you can see already how the red peak is very narrow. And as we saw before, when the camera is in a warm tone mode, it is less sensitive to the warm tone. So having a narrow band like this is going to create some challenges. So what you're trying to do is go as much volume of spectral data in the warm tone, and we're able to achieve that through having a warm tone white. So it's a phosphor white that gives us that spectrum. We also look at this portion here, this dip. This usually references or has an impact on color rendering, and the lower it is, the lower the color rendering. So we always try to push this up. Every LED is going to have these spikes, and this is your 450 exciter emission line. This is every white LED has a blue exciter source or emission source. You put a phosphor on it, it halates the phosphor and gives you the rest of the spectrum. So that, as a signature, is going to be on every LED. It may shift a little bit. There are manufacturers that are trying to use slightly different blue points, but that in general sort of treats that. So how does this look when we started analyzing it? XY coordinates, nicely matched. When we look at the PRI, again, these are all numbers that they're reassuring. I mean, we see that the 2 whites give us a slightly higher rendering than a single white. But again, they're very close. So depending on the camera, it may just play out very well. So in this case, we're first of all comparing an Amira to the double white versus a single white. And we're seeing up here that if you've got a little window like I have, you can use your cursor and move it out of the way. So on the gels, everything's below, well, the double white is below 0.12. There we go. You may need 1/8 of a correction, and you definitely want to have a 1/4 correction on this one. So the red Mysterium is going to be showing you some green, and you're going to want to apply some magenta to try to take that out. So again, different cameras, slightly different response. Yet to eye, all this stuff looks the same. If we look at this in the daylight mode, same thing here. You can see how the difference in white spectrum, again, slightly different volume of spectral data. How does this play out? XY coordinates are offset a little bit. Now, one thing to be said, when you're looking at daylight, you can have a broader offset in daylight in terms of Kelvin, and the camera's not going to see it that dramatically different. So 500, even, 1,000 degrees you might start to see, but 500 degrees, barely noticeable, especially when you're looking at a textured set and you're blending a lot of different units together. PRI, again, on average, not bad. We're still seeing a higher value on the 2 whites. When we look at the corrective, we're right on the mark where we're going to get away with a 0.1. Slight difference on the other 2. And again, at that point, where they're that closely matched, you may just say, I can live with that, and it's not going to be a huge difference. Now, if we compare someone who is going for white reproduction using a lot of different wavelengths, how does that play out? So here again, we have the 2 whites, nice and broad, full spectrum, and we're trying to construct a spectrum now using multiple sources. So red, green, blue, sapphire blue, cyan, lime green, amber. And XY coordinates they're a little offset. When we look at the actual numbers up here, close enough. We're not going to see an issue with that. I mean, those are damn close. When we look at the PRI, also those are fairly decent numbers, but this is where it gets a little squirrely. We go up here now to how does the Amira between the 2 whites and the constructed spectrum see it? Well, a full fat magenta correction. On the red Mysterium, same spectrum as the Amira is seeing very green, it sees neutral. So again, here we're playing out how 2 different response curves from different cameras treat the same spectrum differently. And if we look at the same in daylight, XYs match, PRIs look pretty decent. And over here we see some huge differences. So over here, we're now seeing as much as 1/8 and a 1/4 magenta correction. And previously, where in tungsten, this was a 0.07, no correction necessary. Now suddenly we're seeing it go way the hell up. And this is where, on the one hand, where you think you're okay because you've been shooting in tungsten and you haven't seen any anomalies, and now you're shooting in daylight and you use the same light source and you simply dial it in, and suddenly it's very green. And if you don't pick it up on the day, rather in post, now you've got a sizable green issue that you're going to try and correct out. So this is the kind of thing where things can change on you, where you think you know what's going on, but unless, I mean, we're doing in-depth analysis and we're seeing where these challenges lie.
Hey, Peter.
Yeah.
So Dan Fletcher asked, what do you mean by full spectrum white? If a light source generates full spectrum of light, how can it have different color temp?
The full spectrum light comes into play when we go back. So when I say full spectrum light, I'm talking about a phosphor light. You may try to achieve a full spectrum light by adding a lot of different wavelengths. And as I illustrated earlier, the response curves of the camera play strongly in how they reproduce this quote unquote white light. So the fact that you have different methodologies of achieving what we call white light. That in combination with different response curves of the cameras, this is where you start setting up these larger differences. So my gut feeling is the easiest way to do this, because since we've had this huge history in blending for fluorescent lamps, there's so much spectral data that is a smooth curve in a phosphor white that when you start lining up different wavelengths, these are all little peaks that you're just shoving together to try to simulate that full spectrum. Once you put that on camera and the camera response curves are different, this is where these differences start to play out. So you can try as much as you want to take a constructed spectrum through multi-bands of color and try to come up with white. You're still not going to have the same response as you do with a phosphor white. This is a challenge. And there are different philosophies on how to do this. We've done a tremendous amount of camera modeling, and we know where the pitfalls are. And so we thought the most efficient way of doing this and treating the cameras where the cameras see at least the white somewhat more consistently is by going to a phosphor white. I hope that sort of answers it. And here's the dog's breakfast that we have when we walk on a set today, where we haven't done the camera tests in advance. We just know, they seem to work, or I don't know, it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. What we have are the two whites in green. We see the RGB in red, and we have the, don't get away from me. We see the the multicolor approach. And so this is all 6500. And so we take that into an analysis. Okay, XYs are a little off, but they're different. I think we'll get away with it. Rendering wise, we're rendering a lot of the colors, and especially here on this one, now here I thought, we'll look at it, you're using a single camera. The only thing different now are the light sources. So you got a two whites, single white, and multicolor. And we're right on the edge. We could most probably get away with these two being blended. You could time those two together. And this one is way the hell out. And although it's showing a full capture, and this is where the color white point actually falls below the Planckian and below the sensitivity of that camera where it would read daylight as neutral. So if you picture this now in a scene and you've got a light-haired person walking through the scene and they walk through that light source and suddenly they pop green where there's nothing else in the set to motivate that green. And your color timer looks at you and goes, okay, what do you want me to do with that, coach? You go, okay, well, let's float a window in there and just capture that head and let's try to correct it out. What it does to the set, if it's a 3/4 backlight or something, you may get away with it. It's the set, no one really pays attention that much to the coloration differences in the set. But to character, and if it's a main character walking into a scene and there's no motivation for it, this is what frustrates cinematographers and timers. And it's because of the selection of instrument that seemingly work well together, and it may not even be perceptible to the eye. The eye may just see it, hey, we're fine. In post, it bites you. So the question is, okay, so how do we match these lights? We've got all these different manufacturers. How can we harmonize them? Well, to a certain degree you can, but to a certain degree also you just cannot. And the reason for that is what I'm trying to illustrate here, because it's not in the spectrum to begin with. Those challenges are going to be there. You can try to use XY coordinates and try to match up a color point. Now this is a great way actually of trying, if you're walking onto a set, onto a location, and let's say you have a bounce light that's coming from a window and you have a floor that has a coloration, and the light coming off of it is this nice warm spectrum. You go, oh, that's wonderful. How do we reproduce that? So there's one of two things you could do with your meter. You can go and read the Kelvin. You go, okay, well, Kelvin is warmed up. It's going to be this. Or you can say, well, hold on. There's most probably other coloration in this. What if we were to just look at the XY coordinate and see what's in it? And so with an XY, it'll now take you and put that light source on the Planckian where it may pick up those other tonalities. So the XY feature in a meter to reproduce that on an instrument is really cool. And so the Kinos all have an XY capability, and that is independent of the gamut. So whatever the XY value of the meter is, that in a white zone should be reproducible. If it's a distinct color, then the only limitation is the gamut of the fixture. So even here, once you put that value in, it'll basically be defined by the gamut. If it falls outside the gamut, it'll just be reproduced at the same hue angle, but at slightly different saturation. So for all intents and purposes, it'll be pretty damn close.
So, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Iris NG, Iris NG asked, should we assume the individual cameras within the particular camera model capture a given light spectrum consistently? For example, it says, for example, there shouldn't be any variations between two Alexa sensors.
I think that's a safe assumption to make. The type of tolerance differences that you'll see between cameras, I think, are negligible compared to the differences that you're going to see in color emission. So I think the manufacturers take a tremendous effort so that they have consistency in their chips and the way they run their colorimetry. Just like I said, every camera is like a film stock. So just as you choose film stock because there are characteristics it has, you need to be really cognizant of the camera that you choose. Now, just going back to make one other point about where I talk about matching white light. I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit by saying this, but once we introduce the camera profiles, actually I shouldn't jump ahead of myself. I'll talk about it. My apologies here. My mind races at times. So let's see. So color space, such as 709, P3, 2020, those all define their chromosticity points through a value of 100, or in DMX terms, if you're looking at a slider, 255 positions. So that means every gamut is defined by its white point, D65, and there are 255 increments to get to the green point, to the red point, and to the blue point. And so we can plot all those values in that manner. Now, there are tools that allow us to reproduce gels. Now, the gels that Kino Flo has in their gel selection, those color points are all predicated by the Kino Flo gamut. So we read gels in daylight and plotted those within our gamut. So if they fall outside the gamut, we'll plot them to the nearest point that we can reproduce. If you now use this app to, and the other important thing we do in our app, it all starts with a D65 white point. But what we're doing different from many other manufacturers is that once we select a gel, such as, let's say, dark salmon, and we have it, we're displaying it as a daylight source, what we can actually do is take the underlying Kelvin. So this color point here, instead of it being daylight, we can shift it over into the warm zone, or we can actually elevate it. So this, what we call a floating white point, is a really unique feature, so that it's easy for us to match up from our perspective, a color gel that we've modeled. And again, as long as it's within the capability of our gamut, we'll hit those color points no matter what your Kelvin is. So you can actually match up a tungsten source, measure your tungsten source, and it'll be a pretty close match. Now, when you're using an app like this, so this is a show tool swatch, and you have to ask, these numbers have to be relevant to a gamut. What gamut are they in? So, I moved my cursor and it jumped ahead of myself here. So we figured out that they are in a Rec 709 gamut. And there are two ways of looking at it. You can either looking at a percentage in hundreds, or in our case, since we're doing 255 increments, you have to click the little arrow button over here, and it'll take you into the 255 increment position. And so from there, it's a matter of simply inputting those numbers. And again, what we'll do is we'll plot that data to this point, when in fact the actual color point may be out there. So whatever that crossover point is in the 709, these values will reflect that 709 color point. Now, another way of looking at it is through XY, and the Lee has an app where they actually give you XY coordinates. But since I was saying, you know, you can either plot this in daylight or tungsten, in their case, they're saying, okay, we're going to give you source C as daylight and the tungsten setting. So when you go over here and click tungsten, it'll change these numbers. And so in this case, you're actually changing the values according to whether you're in tungsten or daylight. And that puts it wherever that color is supposed to be. Now, again, if that falls outside of 709, your fixture will be able to reproduce it within the gamut of the fixture that you're working with. So it's in its own gamut. When we look at our menu, you're going to see a number of gamuts displayed, including one that is ESTA. I'm only mentioning this now because it's on all the devices now, but we're going to be dropping it. And ESTA is the Entertainment Services and Technology Association. When they first got involved in trying to come up with some way of harmonizing gel colors, he said, well, let's go to the biggest possible gamut and try to map everything within that. We know that the cameras are going to see it, everything's going to see it, so let's just pick this. And so they predicated this on the Kodak Pro Photo color space. And the actual Kodak Pro Photo color space is predicated on a D65 daylight, but they happen to choose 3200. Maybe it's because they came out of the theatrical world. Anyway, that created some issues, and now they're saying, well, maybe we'll just go back to XY for color mapping. I think that may be one of the things that they're going to be recommending. So in our case, you're still going to see the ESTA down there on the next iteration. We're going to be releasing RDM in the next possibly 2 weeks. You will no longer find the ESTA E1.54 option in there. And it did create some confusion.
Hey, Frieder.
Yes.
Dan Fletcher asked, because there's only 100 steps, 255 for DMX, does that mean that there's a bigger color space, has less steps or resolution to get to a color?
No, so the 200, so the difference between 100 and 250, it's just a way of defining the space. So if you have a device, I don't know how the other manufacturers are doing it, if they're putting in values on percentage or if they're using 255, which relates to your slider. The app will give you both of those. So it's a matter of determining, first of all, your control side. If you're working on a board, you're in the 255 mode. It's as simple as that. You're going to take those 255 increments and you're going to plot those accordingly. So it's just it's an index measurement calculation, basically. They both arrive at the same thing. So the number is going to be different between 0 and 100. But in the end, the point will be the same, whether it's between 0 and 255.
Okay.
So I mentioned earlier how XY is a great way of capturing reflected colors because it's going to take you away from just straight Kelvin. It may be a way of matching certain saturated colors in XY. And again, it really comes down to the ability of your device and the gamut of your device to see how closely they can actually reflect those colors. So what have we done? So as Kino Flo, we said, okay, we have enough data now on all these different cameras. We got to at least, let's try to resolve some of the issues. And so we decided some of the major cameras like the Alexa, the Venice, and the DXL, and the VariCam, let's plot those. And as I illustrated earlier, the biggest difference seems to be in how they reproduce white in the warm tones. Our testing shows that if you're shooting daylight, that range of difference between these cameras on an LED white source are going to be less than in the warm tones. And so one of the first to really try this out was John Schwartzman, ASC. He was shooting in London. It was an Emma Thompson movie, a Christmas movie. He did about, I guess now, a year and a half ago or something. And the thought here was, well, what if we established two different zones? So everything that's on an actor's face, just like you would choose a film stock that was consistent, why don't we use a light source where we can actually match the camera to that Kelvin source, to that fixture, to that camera. And so he did, and he said, okay, but since there's so many other instruments that are available for him to work with, and especially from a rental house perspective, when he went, you want to do what? You want to shoot all Kinos? Get the hell out of here. Got all this other gear. Some blue and silver, tons of it. I said, okay, well, what I'll do is this. Since we're on intimate close-ups on sets and whatnot, everything that's inside of this set that's playing on skin tones, I'm going to harmonize it to the camera. It's going to be Kinos on faces, and that other stuff for places. I'm going to stick it in for the backings, through windows, through shears, where that color definition is not going to heavily influence the skin tone. And if it does, there's a motivational device at least. It's coming from a window, and so you automatically accept the fact that something coming through the window is going to be a little different. And it worked stunningly fantastic. He said, this is a game changer. And his colorist noticed it right off the top, because when he came in to do the timing, he basically said, okay, so what do you want me to do? I said, well, there was hardly anything to adjust. And so that immediately was observed by both producers and the director. And he said, well, this is stunning. And again, once you understand the color theory of what's going on, and the reason we're fighting all these color issues is because of what I've just been explaining. Once you can harmonize your light, and if there are two light sources that are very closely matched, then you can use them together on a skin tone. If they're not as matched, then you may want to use it elsewhere. It doesn't mean you don't use it, but you just start to realize where you use it to its best benefit. So just as an illustration, I'm going to show you how that actually plays out on our software. And so I'll be pausing and stopping this as we go. So essentially, you can go into any of the white modes, and normally, if it's tungsten, it's rarely at 3200. So try to match up your tungsten light source as best you can. And when you then go to we call it the LUT, but it's more a profile, and you start to see the differences between these cameras. The default setting, which is like Airy, but then Venice, DXL, Vericam. And again, these are differences that are most noticeable in the white tones at 2700. So let me just play it one last time. So again, since we set up the Alexa, our general profiles as heavily weighted towards the Alexa with a little bit of of a nod to the other camera so that they're not too far off, you sort of see how that plays out. But you can see some noticeable differences in the white tone, and that's going to play on your skin tones. So again, we dial it into 2700, 2900. That's a close approximation to tungsten. And so we shouldn't see too big a difference between the default and the Alexa, but as we go, Venice, DXL, Vericam. Now, we're not going to see this big a difference when it comes to daylight. And so there's less of an issue in daylight. But again, plenty of sets where you, let's see, is this camera profile? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Hold on. Okay. Now, there was an earlier question about, the Kino Flo Gamut is one thing, and this is how we map all these colors. So, we put our gel name. So instead of choosing Lee, Roscoe, Apollo, or GAM color, or any other gels that are out there, one thing we found is that when they try to copy each other, they copy each other pretty well. They also use the same name. So for us, it was more, let's put the most, we have 255 options here, roughly, of which we're using about 200 spots or so, 220 maybe. The number next to it is a placeholder number. So on a slider, that number represents where it would be, where you'd find it on a slider. And if you're working manually between two different units, you could say, well, instead of, can you find mode? Well, where the hell is it? Well, you go 216. This is not a reference to any swatch book or anything. It's just a reference to where it is on the dimmer. And this number now is, as I said earlier, it's predicated on the Kino Flo Gamut. So if I now move this color point into RGB, those are the RGB colors. Those are the RGB values as they come out of the out of our gamut. So those are the numbers. But what happens now when I go to Rec 709 and I take those same numbers and redefine them, you start to see the color differences. So this is where you need to choose your gamut and scale the numbers accordingly. So what we did is what basically happened here is, let me start over again.
Here, Frieder, we have a hand up and a question.
Okay.
Do you want to do the hand up?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Activate your mic.
It's Travis Lehigh.
Hi, sorry, I don't have a hand up, no.
No, okay. Well, did you have a question? Sorry.
No, sorry, I might have accidentally pressed the button. And
Okay, no problem. No problem.
All right,
Okay.
continue.
Okay. So anyway, so here you really see the difference between taking the numbers that are meant for one gamut and simply putting them into another gamut. So in this point now, I'm going to show it again, but now we're going to, on the next, actually this next one, using the, you can mute him again, Sam, if you haven't.
No, I have a question.
Okay.
It said board programming question. Is the LUT selection feature available through the DMX profile?
It will be in the RDM. The RDM version that's being released will have that ability to access those settings. So best to get in touch with us. We can even give you a beta version if you're on something right now and you want to try it out. It's going to be released, I'm hoping within the next 2 weeks. We're in the process right now of doing all the backup documentation, so it it's not too confusing. But yeah, if you get in touch with us, we can share that with you.
Okay.
So in this demo, what I'm going to show is how you can use the app. Again, we're just going off the description. The original color setting you're going to see is on our gamut, and as we move into RGB, we're going to see it change like we showed previously, but then using the app, how to get it back now within that color space. So we go from our gamut, and now we go to 709 and it changes. But now we can bring it back. Since we're in 709, we just need to remap those numbers. And so the data tool gives us the RGB values right up here. And so as we dial those in, you also notice there's a Rec 709 reference, so you know that you're now in that color space. And so there is that number, that gel mapped into 709. And so since it was bigger than, since the gamut was bigger than 709, if I change this back now from 709 to the broader gamut, you see the color change. So that illustrates the difference right there between the Kino Flo gamut, which is larger, and the 709 gamut, which is a little smaller. But excuse me, keep in mind, I'm gonna drink here. If this gets remastered, or if it gets mastered in 709, you're only going to have that saturation level of what was illustrated in the 709 gamut. The Kino Flo gamut will show it more saturated. So the hue angle at 709 will be the same as the regular Kino gamut, but the saturation will be lower in 709. And so the thought behind all of this, by listing all these different gamuts, depending on how manufacturers, what their gamut is, we should be able to remap from a desk. Once we select a gamut, we should be able to take other manufacturers' color points and map them into the same color space. And at that point, the only difference between manufacturers will be their choice of LEDs and whether you can actually match it up or not. And it may not, in some cases, certain saturated colors may not be 100% matchable. So again, there's no fast and easy solution for all of this, but this goes away in explaining, what is actually going on behind the scenes. So again, we're always displaying that 709. So getting close to the end. So you really need to think of your fixture first and foremost as a white light generator, and secondarily as a color generator. Not all white light or all the colors are going to be the same. And so doing your work up front, deciding which units to work with to attain the results you want are going to be very, very important. Use the gamut selection when you're dealing with additive color mixing. You need to understand your workflow in order to determine your gamut. So that this is a dialogue between cinematographer and lighting director, gaffer. And the answer in today's age will most probably be, well, you know what, we're going to be mastering this in 709, P3 in 2020. So you go, okay, well, then might as well stick with the Kino Flo Gamut, and the colors that fall outside the 709 will just be a little desaturated, and we'll work within the colors that Kino's got on there, Kino Flo has on their software. Or you can say, you know what, we'll try using XY matching. We'll replicate as best we can that light, that saturated light, that natural light, that replicated bounce light. We'll map it out in XY, and whatever the output gamut that we master it in, that's what it's going to look like. Then for like I said, so the XY is going to be that limitation it's going to be limited by the gamut of that fixture. And keep in mind the notice that I talked about gels, if that was going to be really important. So gels on a full spectrum white light or subtractive color, that may still get you somewhere where you're not going to be able to get other than through either an HLI source or a tungsten source. This concept of shooting in zones is something that is really starting to gather some traction. We've got an HBO show down here now where they've taken all this to heart and going, yeah, well, the locations are small enough. We can actually do this now. We can actually work in a close-up zone within 8 feet of the actors. We're going to try and make sure that all those colors that we're working with, those fixtures, all harmonize to the camera. And it's going to save time and money downstream. So where it may actually cost a little more upfront, maybe having to put a few more instruments that would maybe not have been part of the inventory of the rental company, well, it's going to save you money downstream. The other thing that I never touched on, and that is pick the appropriate size fixture. Now, originally in our industry, we were sold on the fact that, well, this is a 400 watt instrument, it's powerful. You can dial this puppy down to just about Zippo. And yeah, but the problem is when you have a very high powered fixture, and if you're choosing to operate down in the 10, 15% range, when you're mixing that number of color points, as you dim down, at some point, you're going to lose that color definition because some values cannot be sustained. So those LEDs are going to drop out first. And when that does, now all your colorimetry goes out the window. So it does make sense to have various sized instruments. So if you're going to be working in tight, work with something small, something that you know is going to hold color. Also ask, is this fixture cracking on the blanket? I mean, how well does it do that? The other note is camera profiles, best applied when working white light. Those profiles, when it comes to gel colors, that's going to be anybody's guess at this point because we just have not had the time to map every different camera that we're showing there to be very specific to colors. It's something that we're going to do in the future, but there's an awful lot of mathematics involved. And as we do this, these cameras do change. So this is where pre-production planning comes in. So if there are certain colors you want, you need to work with a camera that you're going to be using. Try to work with a set of lenses you're working with and with the instrument, and then determine what instruments are going to give you that color that you're asking for. So in conclusion, just as Rembrandt and Vermeer chose their pigments carefully, we are the cinematographers of today are the modern day Rembrandts. And they have to be as critical about picking their spectral palettes. They have to be careful about the camera they use. They have to be careful about the lights they use. They have to be fully aware of the spectrum of that light, how is it constructed? How does it compare to some of the other instruments that I'm working with? And this is the first time that we really had to operate on this level of complexity. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to embed a lot of the color science that Kodak had originally embedded in the film emulsion. We're trying to embed that in the lighting instrument. So by saying, okay, listen, this is going to harmonize to the DXL, that is an embedding of color data that is in the light. So that is very much like the film stock. And again, just a word of clarification, when we call our settings, our profiles LUTs, it's only because it's a lookup table. It does not equate to a camera LUT where you're actually changing the look of the camera. Think of your LED fixture as a white light generator and a range of colors it can reflect back to the camera, as well as the color generator and what gamut range of colors it can project. When mixing these different forms of white light, take the time to test. Make sure that they harmonize at the Kelvin settings that you are going to be working in. Test the choice of camera to your lights. The fixture's color science is the 21st century pigment. The fixtures are the brushes. Choose your pigment wisely, or spend that time in color grading and suffer the consequences. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of it. So I'm very happy to take questions, and you can take me off my share. Let's see. I can get back to, there we go. Hello there. So open for questions on it. There's an awful lot of data there to absorb, and so but it hopefully gives you some idea of, all the stuff that's gone into what we're doing on our end of it to try to simplify it for the end user. And when you now encounter issues on the set and you're trying to match something up, you may be able to cut to the chase pretty quickly and say, it's outside of the gamut more likely, and we're never going to get this thing fixed. So it's the choice of instrument that has to be looked at.
So Frieder, there's a few questions. There was actually a question from Dan Fletcher. It kind of went on from his last question, which his last question was, because there's only 100 steps to 255 DMX, does it mean that bigger color space has less steps or resolution to get to a color? And then you answered that, and then he went on by saying, I mean, for the steps in between, for example, if you have a full blue 255, if you want less blue, you could go down to 254. If you use the 709 gamut versus the 2020 gamut, there is more blue spectrum available in 2020 gamut. So going down to 255 from 254 in the 709 space is a smaller step than going down one step.
Yes, yeah. Again, it's all scale. All of this is scaled. So, you've got 255 increments. Now, we're also looking at, we're in 8-bit at this point, or I think right now, I think we're in 8-bit. So once we go to 16-bit, we're going to be able to break up those increments even finer. So for fine tuning, we'll be able to increase that range. But yeah, the scale is predicated on the size of that gamut. So a difference of 10 increments in 2020 is much less than, or I would say, it's going to be a smaller range than in 709. So 10 increments in 709, you expand that out to 2020. That's a big range in 2020.
Okay. Colin Holt, CSE asked, do we have to worry about the control forgetting that you've selected a non-default setting like Alexa or 709? It would be scary to learn one light has changed back to default on us on Thursday night.
Yeah, okay, so on the display, you actually see the camera on the display. And again, once you're operating on a desk, then all that gets locked into the desk profile and nothing shifts. If you're in manual mode, let's see, do we have, see if I have that. If you take me back to share screen.
Sure.
Let's see if it's illustrated in the film.
There you go.
Yeah. Share. So we actually have in the display. Let me see. Let me go. It's not letting me go backwards. Here we go. There we go. Let me get up to.
I have a controller here with me.
Let me see if it's there. Because actually what we see is in the display, you will actually see a C reference right in here. If a camera is selected, I think this was still done in default mode, so you don't see it. But there's actually, yeah, okay, so it's in default, so you don't see it. But what you do see is on the, let's take it back. So right in between DIM and CCT, you're going to see a reference to a C1, C2, C3, C4. And those refer to the different camera settings. So in your display, you're always going to have a reference to, if you're in 709, it'll be displayed up here. It'll say 709. And if you've got a camera selected, it'll be down here. So again, I'm only recommending the camera for the warm tones, because that's where you see the largest difference. You can play it in daylight just to be safe, but it has less of an impact over there, because again, we're talking about that whole issue of a D65 chip, and we're dealing with a full spectrum white, and it handles that very nicely.
This is the camera. This is the selection you're referring to, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So down in here, if you can see my cursor, is this being shared? I can't tell.
No, you can't see it.
Oh. Oh no. Where am I? I seem to be lost. I lost my connection here. I can't see anybody anymore.
Did you see me? No. Well, you're still broadcasting.
Still broadcasting. Okay.
Yeah, we can still see you.
Okay. Well, then maybe just take me out of screen share.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, here we go. There, I see it now. Okay. Yeah. So yeah. So bottom line is, yeah.
It was this, right?
Yeah.
So that would tell you the camera that you're on, and
right.
Right.
But yeah, that's a valid point. Now the other thing you can do, we've got that lock button. You want to show it again, Sam? So once you've actually have those settings, you can hit that red lock button over there, and now nobody can mess with it. And again, once it's set, you really have to dig into the menu to make that selection. So just manipulating any of the presets or any of that should not have an effect on your camera selection. Again, we never had the issue on the Schwartzman show. That to our knowledge, it never happened. So again, we're making it a little more difficult to reach in there and make those changes. And so once you're out of that, you're far enough away from the being able to accidentally nudge it.
Okay, so that was Colin Hope. Then Darcy Hutchison asked, as someone who is brand new to the business, do you have suggestions on information I should carry around as a cheat sheet?
That's a good one. Everyone has, you've got your iPhone. You can always try to set up the links to the various manufacturers where they have their operation manuals. That's always helpful to have. There's so much information out there today to have to have an instant access, you need a database, to be quite honest. So, if you have a tablet or something that you can store operation manuals, that's maybe a way of doing it. But yeah, I think simply trying to have access to manufacturers' operation manuals, I think is about the best way. And then when you have time to try to look at videos and things like that, that illustrate what's going on, that's the other way of getting information. And quite frankly, if you go to any one of the rental houses and you want to play with some of this stuff, it's kind of challenging now in the COVID world because they don't want people in the shop anymore. But post-COVID, or if they'll let you take one out for a day to just work through menus and things like that, that you might find the rental companies willing to do that for you. So that's our recommendation.
Gary Denault, he asked, how do you account for changes to a fixture color gamut as it ages, and the white phosphorus degrading as well as the RGB emitters aging at different rates?
That is an issue that is potentially out there. And for that very reason, we operate our instruments dramatically below. I mean, they could be much brighter. Lumen degradation curves and color shift are a function of phosphor aging and heat, and more directly, it's heat. And this also applied to fluorescent tubes even more so because those things got smoking hot. But when it comes to LEDs, we purposefully run them underdrive them so that the lumen degradation curve is dramatically extended out. We are tracking some of these performance, because what we do is when we send out an instrument, we actually capture the spectrum of that instrument. So should that ever come back to us, we'll actually be able to plot. We have other data that we can pull out of the software, diagnostics that tell us how long it's been burning and for what kind of temperatures. And then from that, we should be able to determine what kind of lumen degradation curves are experiencing in real world scenario. So based on testing that was available to us, we then purposely underdrove we are underdriving our lamps. But it's a potential issue. One of the things that we've talked about it, if it should ever come to be an issue, and after 7 years of this now, we've not seen it, but we may have a way of recalibrating an instrument down the road should it ever become necessary. Because once you have control over all the different elements, then yes, in theory, we should be able to accommodate it. There's a practical side to all this, and that is that these products are so rapidly evolving that the relevance of a fixture that we have today, unlike in the days of old where you can have a fixture from the 1930s, just slam a tungsten into it, it's going to perform admirably. The features that are available on solid state lighting may be the defining relevance of the product. So when you have a market that says, yeah, I know that fixture, but this other stuff is giving me all these other capabilities that I don't have in that instrument. And so you may find that instruments that cannot be upgraded to the latest features that become industry sort of demand, then those instruments will then start to fall out of favor. But I suspect I think, at least in terms of the Kinos, the color issue is going to be the last thing that we have to be concerned about. I can't speak for other manufacturers. I have no idea how they drive their stuff and if they're already on the hairy edge, as it were. Every now and then you hear of some stories about some instruments that are off color, and we did have one instance, and all we can determine is that somebody must have baked the instrument. The entire fixture came back to us. It was in the UK, and there was actually plastic melted into the extrusion. How you would do that, I don't know. But the entire panel was magenta, and so we swapped out the panel, and the software was not affected. Everything performed to spec. So somehow those LEDs were cooked. Mm-hmm. So yes, heat will have that.
Okay.
Q&A here now. John Holasco.
Yeah.
yeah, some DPs depend too much on the DITs, and this color temperature discipline is still critical and valuable today. Yeah, I do also I find also that shooting in daylight is more forgiving to temperature nuances because I believe the sensor is, yeah, and that's absolutely right. You know, these are D65 sensors. As long as you're working in a full spectrum white, and it's a relatively, when I say full, again, when you look at the that distribution of spectral data, if it's as broad as you can possibly get it, the likelihood of the camera seeing all that, and we saw from the camera gamuts what they're able to capture, the camera's going to see it, and you've got the data. Whatever is not in the spectrum of that light cannot be reflected, cannot be read by the camera. You cannot generate a color that the camera can't see. So no amount of filtration on a light is going to, you know, give you a color if that color is not inherent in the white light source. So if you have a constructed white light source that is made up of multi-bands and your particular color falls between two color points or two color spikes, the likelihood of that reproducing accurately is going to be diminished as a gel. Let's see. It was about the HMIs still. Reminds me, HMIs, I still color temp all fixtures and place them according away from the lens. Yeah. HMIs have always been notorious. And I know any show that I would do, I'd first basically catalog all the HMIs and have a filter pack and a tag on each head with a filter pack that was needed, and depending on usage, have those changed out on a regular basis. But yeah, but you know, you once you understand where the technology is, you learn how to use it. And so you make whatever accommodations are necessary. So Todd Armstrong, do you recommend any quality text sources for folks new to working with cameras, programming electrics? Wow. You know, when it comes to cameras and stuff, a lot of practical understanding. I don't know if any texts, there are some books being written nowadays. I know that Ellen Steinheimer has just produced a book which covers a broad range of sort of introductory level information. But to get into camera specifics, you want to try to spend time with a second AC or someone that can sort of walk you through it. And it's all time. You just need time with these cameras. There's so many subtleties. And just reading a text is not gonna do it. It's a good start. So if there are texts that are published, by all means, get any information any way you can. And then getting your hands on is really gonna drive it home.
There's a question in the chat box by Dan Bolis.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Is it possible to set up a lamp to, where to go? Is it possible to set up a lamp to project light set to predetermined color curves for specific cameras, or possibly diffracting, diffusing, or conforming within camera color spectrum? Well, basically, that's what we're doing. Is when we set up our lights, it'll be projecting out a spectral curve that is conformed to the response curve of the camera, or it's optimized, let's say. If you do that with another, I mean, there are analysis equipment that you could do, I guess, and you can read light sources, and if the manufacturer lets you get in there and try to adjust all the different levels, then yes, you could. Again, you know, scientifically or on the bench, there are a lot of things you can do to instruments. Or there are a number of things you can do, let's say. The bigger issue is we never have time on set. This is all in pre-production. We don't get paid for pre-production. So what you want to do is you take your pre-production time, use it as best you can. You want to get your makeup and hair and wardrobe and set colors verified. And then when you do have a problem, now you need to dig in and try to resolve the problem. And so using the tools that are at hand, very often it helps to reach out to manufacturers such as ourselves, explain the problem, and we can maybe help talk you through it. Yeah, it's a challenge.
So here, we're pretty much done. I was going to open the conversation for everyone, or
You can, if anybody wants to say anything else.
okay. So let me open up everyone's mic so that way.
Yeah, I think everybody can see the chats, right? They can see those replies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In case anybody wants to just jump on and have just a conversation.
Oh, it's nice to see Ian Folds there. Yeah, thanks again to Ian for facilitating this. It's the kind of information I think that just needs to be out there, and it just helps explain, what a lot of these things are that are on these instruments and how different manufacturers are trying to, address the challenges that we're all dealing with. So I guess the only way people can talk is they have to raise their hand and then you open up their mics or what?
They have to unmute themselves.
Oh, I see.
I just did.
Oh, wonderful. Hey, John.
How you doing, Frieder?
Yeah, I'm decent. I'm decent.
Me too.
So I hope this was somewhat helpful. This is the first time we're doing it in this fashion. I've always done Zoom meetings, but to do it as a webinar, we can get a lot of people in here and play it out this way. So yeah, I hope it was somewhat helpful.
Always helpful, my friend. All your knowledge and expertise. Like I said in the chat box, the discipline of color temperature is even more related today because there's been, what I've seen, a kind of a lax attitude with, everything so fast and speed and everything else. And we're mixing many more different types of fixtures.
Right.
That it's more critical because they all have their different properties. In the old tungsten days, you could tell with your eye, that's 26, that's 32, put it here, put it there, bingo, go. So still giving my color temperature meter a workout.
Oh, yeah, so not the Minolta, I hope.
Yes.
Okay, I just urge you to throw that garden party and bury it.
Okay, I will.
It always gave us faulty data, but we used it as a tool because as a comparative meter, it would at least give you the differences. And then you sort of worked into a style and you knew, if I do this and that, I think this will all work out in the end,
So which one should I get?
I think the Minolta C800 is the closest thing to providing the data that you now need. And it's something that I hope they follow through on some of their software updates. You may have to pay for it, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get them to update that meter so it'll actually display gamut. Because what would be great is that if you had a means of looking at any manufacturer and very quickly determine what gamut they have. And then you could also start comparing different manufacturers and see, how are they different? Are these going to play well together? Because all these other indexes we have give us these vague numbers that relate to a mathematical value. And, in and of itself, it's an interesting sort of, intellectual exercise, but there's really not much I can do with those numbers. And that's why we ended up going to the degree that we did of developing a spectrometer where we could actually pull in the response curve of a camera and actually analyze in depth what is happening. How is it seeing white light? Where is it putting it? How is it seeing it? Is it on the Planckian, above, below? Where is it really, how is it harmonized? So that was everything that opened it up for us. Beyond that, we're just, our previous thing was you shoot a lot of camera tests. And that takes forever. And this way we can pull up multiple cameras and compare them one-on-one instantly and see where that's going. So I think we can maybe wrap it up. So I just want to thank all the remaining participants for having the patience to sit through this. It's the kind of thing we'd like to do more often. And we may do some specialty ones just for, say, once the RDM is available, and just get board operators on board to do and that may be just an open Zoom where we can sort of talk through it. It'll be fewer people, I'm sure, than we had. I mean, what was our final tally over here? We had a registrants of about 147, and in the end, we ended up with about, was it about 60 or so?
It was 148, about 75 were there with us throughout the entire thing.
That's cool.
I think it topped off at 78.
Yeah. Which is pretty good. That's great.
There's one more question from Fast Eddie
Yeah.
in the Q&A.
Go ahead. You still on, Eddie? Fast Eddie? Is this mic open?
Yeah, Frieder. Yes,
Hey.
I am. Sure. Thank you so much. Listen, so informative. My brain hurts.
Yeah,
now.
I think of that. Yeah.
I think
sorry.
I might need to take a nap and rest my brain
Yeah.
and
It's heavy.
watch the recording a couple of times just to get all the fine details. This was really quite something. We don't, get the opportunity to learn about this a lot
No.
without, delving into encyclopedias and books. And the only other person that, that informs me and that I get to talk to about this kind of stuff is Doug Coe, who I'm sure you know, who's got, he's very knowledgeable, as you are, on all this type of material. I'm pulling out a bunch of 21s and 31s for our next show. It starts in a couple weeks. The first Netflix feature out of the gate here in Toronto is kind of a beta test in this pandemic style of shooting. Are we going to be able to get some of those, those wireless new ballasts that you were, showing?
Well, first of all, everything you have right now is wireless. Okay.
Yes, no, I know, but the 140DX or whatever it was called.
Those. Well,
Yeah.
they're available.
This LED 140X. I'm not
Sam
sure.
can answer that question.
Okay, well, I was just, I'm quite excited to maybe try that.
They're
Ballast.
available. So just ask for it. And you're working through Whites, or who are you working through?
Sim International.
Or Sim? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I will definitely, but they are available, Sam. And
They are.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great.
Yeah.
It's not
And again-
that wasn't sort of a beta test that you were showing us there or anything.
No.
No.
Fantastic.
Everything. By the way, everything that we talked about today is in the software. It's in the T44 tubes, so that the replacement to the fluorescent 4-bank fixture.
Right.
All these capabilities are in the entire product line, outside of the original bicolors,
Right.
which a lot of those are phased out of the market.
Yeah. I mean, we've been using, trying to always use the latest, greatest, that Kino Flo supplies. And obviously these wireless ballasts have been very, very handy for us for the last couple of years. It's just that now with that option of, all the color rendering and the camera indexing and stuff, that takes it to the next level.
Yeah. So when do you actually start shooting? Because we're going to be releasing that RDM software, and with it will be a few other tweaks. So for instance, in the Gamut selection, we're going to take out the ESTA Gamut because it's being abandoned. But again, this was already, we put that in there almost 2 years ago.
Right.
And so again, with every upgrade, we are just bringing everything up to current standard, which is great. If you have an instrument that you bought even 3 and 4 years ago, it'll be operating at today's level. It's a matter of updating the software. Now, some rental companies may be somewhat remiss in not having kept up to speed. So what are we at, 4.2 now or something?
4.1. We're still 4.1. Yeah.
Right.
And
I'm certainly going to send out an email and ask for it tomorrow morning when we start back into our last week of prep. We go. We have shoot day 0. On Tuesday, after our Canadian Thanksgiving long weekend. So I guess basically our last week of prep starts tomorrow, and then from there we're shooting.
Awesome. Good luck. Good luck.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Also, I hope that are any guys on from Vancouver? I just pray to God that they get their testing results so they're back online, because I mean, what a freaking disaster that is.
Well, I really hope that we don't run into those same sorts of issues, but I've already seen in our particular production that we have gone from a 36-hour turnaround on testing to a 72-hour turnaround on testing.
boy.
already, and you know, we're tested twice a week, and so it could kind of put a wrench into the monkey works there a little bit if that
Well,
progresses.
it sounds to me like there's a huge business opportunity right now for labs to start up. I don't know how fast it takes to get them up and running. But John Schwartzman sent me an email from London where he's doing the newest Jurassic Park. And they've been following the pod system. And they had, I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago or so, they had three techs come down with a positive. So that was on a Thursday. Friday, they shut down, tested everybody, all came back negative, tested again Saturday, tested again Sunday, all came back negative. Monday, they were back up and shooting. But at the same time, we are also seeing that they're now testing every day on that show to a tune of 250,000 a week. Just stunning ton of money going for testing. And they're in the last, I think they're now entering their fourth week of last week of shooting. They just want to burn through and not get any interruption. So,
well, thanks again. Thanks again to both of you guys. I really appreciate you doing this, and I really hope, like you said, Frieder, I hope you get to do a little bit more of this for us. Thanks.
I'll be reaching out as soon as we have more to say, and if we need to do a rebroadcast or a repeat of this, we're happy to do it. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Frieder. Thanks, Sam. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All right. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Stay healthy.
All right.
Stay well, everyone. Yes, by all means. Cheers. Bye now.
Cheers.
Perfect. Thanks. Bye.
All right. Bye now.
Now, what is production?